Grace without accountability is enabling. I think there has to be some accountability. If you want the two things, if you want the treatment and you want a road to recovery, a road to sobriety, a road back to a job and stability and independence, there could and should be strings attached.
Welcome to the Restorations Podcast. I'm Caitlyn McKenney of Discovery Institute's Fix Homelessness Initiative, and I recently sat down with actor Billy Baldwin and homelessness policy expert Robert Marbut. You're going to hear from them about an upcoming documentary they've created and also about a case heard at the Supreme Court that will have implications for homelessness in every city across the U.S. All of this and more coming up today on the Restorations Podcast, a space to dive deeper into the politics surrounding homelessness, addiction, crime, and other issues facing your cities right now. Our cities and the people in them are worth fighting for, and that only starts when you know what's happening in them and what you think about it. Here are some important things that have happened recently. In case you missed it, the man who recently helped expose the conditions inside a low-barrier housing building in downtown Seattle recently passed away from a meth overdose while living there. Mike Matzik lived in Plymouth Housing's Lewiston Scargo building and brought Discovery journalist Jonathan Cho into his apartment to share what life looked like inside. The video that came out of that experience took the internet by storm, and I think for a lot of us it was extremely eye-opening to the reality inside of housing buildings like this. We're talking about building staff providing drug paraphernalia to the residents living there to use in their rooms with each other, human feces on the ground, rat infestations, and Mike was the one in this video to show us all of that. And now he is a victim of the kind of cruel and false compassion that allows someone to enable a person's deadly addiction. And that's what happened to Mike. Listen to Mike's brother talk about him falling his death.
Probably at least once a week throughout the years. And I just every day worried about him. But I would say that he never really got better. He looked worse the last time I saw him a couple of months ago.
But he was indoors. You know, people always say once you're indoors, you get better.
He was really, I think he was living to smoke meth, to tell you the truth. And I know that he would always say, my friend that lives down the hall, my friend. And I knew when he was telling me that was the meth group of people. And when he would call me, I could hear people sometimes in the back. I say, where are you? He said, I'm in my apartment. I would tell Mike, you're going to die, and he just couldn't get out of that.
Let's be really clear about this, because I think this gets buried often in the harm reduction conversation that we hear. Active addiction to a deadly substance will always end in death. It can be delayed by life-saving measures, and those measures are good, that stop overdose from being deadly, that prevent an overdose from starting, but the end path is unchanged. Active addiction to a deadly substance is going to end in death. It's compassionate to take life-saving measures. We should always do that, but we can't stop there. We have to go further. That's not enough. Mike needed treatment, not just another clean needle or more foil, or testing for fentanyl. And we join Mike's family and friends in mourning the tragic loss of his life. Every now and then, we get a glimmer of hope that maybe mainstream media is willing to give a voice to something outside of their typical accepted narrative on homelessness, on housing, on addiction. In case you missed it, Greg Kim at the Seattle Times recently wrote about the skyrocketing amount of money that low-income housing nonprofits have not been paid by their tenants. It's almost impossible to see how any of these housing providers can continue to operate, let alone how they're currently operating and still afloat. One of the nonprofit CEOs was quoted in the article saying that excessive rent loss will decimate Seattle's community of nonprofit housing providers. The executive director of another nonprofit said, we see people receiving income and not putting that to rent. It's refreshing to see the Seattle Times willing to platform the idea that people who are capable of paying rent, who are making an income, just aren't paying because under the law they don't have to. And that completely goes against the narrative that we so frequently hear and that we're trying to challenge here, that tenants are always the victim and landlords are always the villains. In this case, it's landlords that are the victims of a system that has forced them to provide housing uncompensated for free. No one should be surprised that this is what happens. This is the end result when you enact an eviction moratorium for years during COVID, and then make it as hard as possible for a landlord to remove a tenant that can't pay. We all want people to have homes and places to live and to have housing. Let's remember that there's no way for someone to live in housing for free. Someone is always paying. If it's not the tenant, if it's not the resident, then it's the family that owns the home, or it's me and you, the taxpayers, paying for someone else's housing while paying for your own. And that's not fair. And lastly, in case you missed it, the United States Supreme Court heard arguments for Grants Pass v. Johnson, a case that could change how every single city in the U.S. addresses homelessness moving forward. Right now, under current rulings, a city cannot enforce a public camping ban in their city unless they have shelter beds available for their entire homelessness population. Grants Pass, a city in Oregon, is challenging that ruling, and they've taken it all the way up to the Supreme Court. They created an ordinance that prohibited public camping in their city, and now they're fighting to defend that law. I love a good, juicy Supreme Court case, and this is definitely one of them. The arguments presented to the court recently, I read through them. Our senior fellow, Robert Marbut, who you'll hear from shortly, was there in the court. The arguments hinged largely around distinguishing between the status of an individual and the conduct or the behavior that they act upon. Does fining someone for camping on the street punish them for being homeless, which is a status, or does it punish them for camping on the street, which is a conduct? Or are those two things, camping on the street, being homeless, so inseparable that prohibiting camping on the street is essentially prohibiting homelessness or homeless people? The takeaway to me was that when you try to start answering these questions, you quickly find yourself in the nitty-gritty, in the weeds of individual complex choices, situations, causes behind someone's homelessness. The one thing that I think should be very clear is that it's local government who should be the ones wading through the complexities of those situations and those personal choices and making decisions informed from how close they are to the situation about how to handle them. Not judges making sweeping rulings that decide the details for them. I'm really eager to see how this one pans out. And now, before we hear from them, I would like to give you some background on our guests on this episode. Robert Marbut is a senior fellow at Discovery Institute and one of the leading experts, if not the leading expert on homelessness in America. Robert served as the executive director of the Interagency Council on Homelessness under both the Trump and Biden administrations. He's also the executive producer of an upcoming documentary, the No Address documentary, which is narrated by none other than William Baldwin. If you don't know, Billy Baldwin is an actor. He is featured in the companion film to the documentary, and he's also involved in the issue of homelessness. Let's hear from Robert and Billy. Welcome, Billy Baldwin and Robert Marbut, to the Restorations Podcast. Thank you for joining me today. It's great to have you both here. I want to start off by asking this because I think anyone watching this is going to be wondering, how does a think tank policy expert and a Hollywood celebrity actor end up sitting next to each other on a podcast about homelessness in Seattle? So tell us a little bit about...
It's not just that.
I am not a think tank policy expert, but I play one on television. I know all my lines. No.
But both of you guys together, how are you here together? How did this
And
get
it's
started?
more than that. We've found out, I think...
We've gone to battle.
Yeah, we've gone to battle on...
Unbeknownst, we discovered this in our friendship. Yeah, we've gone to battle a few times. We're on opposite ends of the think tank. I'm the think part, and he's the tank part. I'm telling you, we should take this on the road, and we should go to sit down with, not the extreme lunatics on either side, but some of the more people that are more in the middle. And I think we would show by example how, this is a classic issue where there is consensus and there is agreement and there is an opportunity for bipartisan support. And even on this issue, there's not. You and I are working together. Clearly, you're the expert in the field, and I'm someone that's sort of along for the ride, but has a lot of interest and passion and some knowledge in the space. For decades now, I've been active in this area, of the area of homelessness, the tragedy of homelessness. But a lot of that was 30, 35 years ago. And then I got married, I became a father, I started focusing on parenting, and it wasn't until this film over the last few years that I've been reintroduced to it, and I've learned a lot. I mean, I haven't learned a lot in the last couple of years. I've learned a lot here in Seattle over the last 3 days.
And what I think is sort of interesting about that, I'm definitely on the right side. He's definitely on the left side. And I think we may have voted for one person.
And I'm on the right side, and you're on the wrong side.
Right.
And so we go through the issues, and we're probably on, and I don't want to say we disagree, but we have a lot of wide variety of thinking. But we even have been on the opposite sides of our sports. I led the effort to keep my sport in the Olympics, which ended up knocking out his sport. He's still bummed about that.
No, we're back. We're back. But you're the one teetering on the brink. Now, he was with modern pentathlon, I was with Olympic wrestling, and we were purged from the Olympic core because they shrunk the core from 26 to 25 sports. And then we were able to get wrestling reinstated through a campaign that took, a year and a half. And we went to Russia, we went to Buenos Aires, we went to Argentina, we were, presenting at IOC annual meetings and stuff, and finally we were allowed back in. But it was because of some people behind the scenes in modern pentathlon that they stayed in. They were specifically responsible for their sport staying in the core, which is great.
But then he got knocked out.
About our sport being forced out of the core, and people behind the scenes in modern pentathlon being involved, in being very instrumental in wrestling getting purged, that upset me. But
so on almost every issue, political or Olympic sports, you guys are on opposite ends.
That bothers me. That bothers me because I literally have people on Twitter that attack me, and you can't correspond with each other unless you follow each other. So they're following me, and I'm like, I follow them back, and I said, listen, I don't follow you. I've never seen one of your posts. I don't comment on anything you do. What you're saying is dangerous and harmful. I said, I think we should have a conversation about it. I go, here's my personal cell phone number. Call me right now. And I'll send some totally unknown guy who's like ranting against me for months on Twitter. And I'll send him my number and we'll talk. After a 5-minute conversation, I'm like, do you realize we have 80% overlap in how we feel on this topic? We have like overwhelming consensus on this. There's like a couple of areas where we don't agree, and we probably may never agree. But I would have a conversation with people about, gun safety, and ask them 6 or 7 or 8 questions in a row, and they would say, yes, yes. Do you agree with this? Yes, yes, yes. I'm like, we're more than halfway there. We don't really disagree.
Yeah.
We agree. So I think if we were to go down from homelessness to gun safety to campaign finance reform, I bet you we have a lot more overlap than we agree more than we disagree.
Yeah. And you've come together, especially on this issue. Tell us a little bit about the documentary that we're going to see later tonight. That's how you guys are both here right now.
Well, what was really cool was Billy was one of the first persons cast into the movie. And so we were doing a theatrical movie, and we were trying to raise general awareness for the community across the general public. And as we started doing that, we started talking about how do we authenticate it? How do we make it real? That was part of my initial involvement in getting into the movie. And one of the things I asked for with Robert Craig was, can we either write in the contract or get some understandings that when we bring in the talent, the actors, we'd like to take them into some encampments or Salvation Army or rescue mission or some others and go learn together. And then that spawned the going across the country, which then got into a whole documentary, which we start the private airings this month, and then we'll go to the festival circuit and hopefully be streaming by the end of the summer. And it was all about how to make the movie authentic initially. And we just got so much video. We got so many sound bites. We got so many real thoughtful people thinking about it. And we said, let's package that into a documentary. And then Billy was kind to be the narrator of it. And again, I think it's, I'm on the right, he's on the left. I'm definitely a Republican. I don't think you've ever been a Republican in your life. I don't think that would ever happen. And to get people to start saying, we have a lot more in common than we have different. On this issue, we hope to really move the ball and also show that if we can get along and move this issue, everybody should be a get along. In many ways, homeless shouldn't really be a partisan issue. Homelessness should really be a
you
common
disagree
sense.
with your party on the major roadblock with your party, and I disagree with the major roadblock with my party. You know, you said it yourself. Republicans don't want to fund it, and Democrats don't want to. I don't know the exact word you used, but I think you said force it.
Yeah, don't want to push for the treatment.
Yeah, so force them into treatment. I agree. I agree that Republicans should fund it, and I also agree that it's to have this low barrier. What's the term you were using when they were? You know,
Come as you are.
Yeah, and having no accountability.
Grace without accountability is enabling.
Is enabling. Grace without accountability is enabling. I think there has to be some accountability. If you want the two things, if you want the treatment and you want a road to recovery, a road to sobriety, a road back to a job and stability and independence, there could and should be strings attached. And I think that if, when we responded on the street yesterday to Blessing and he was having a seizure, he was overdosing, and we had social workers there, we had first responders there, we had the police department, the fire department, and he just refused treatment and they left. And I think that a social worker with a first responder should be able to override that if this person is putting themselves in danger or the community in danger. And clearly Blessing was putting both in danger yesterday, himself and the community. And I have no problem with someone saying, we're going to put you into protect them, put them into a 72-hour hold, let them detox, let them become sober, and let them make a more educated, informed decision on whether or not they want further treatment when they're not high on fentanyl or heroin or meth or something.
Absolutely. And I'm guessing most Americans probably are somewhere in that common ground space that we're talking about here, and we just hear such loud voices.
And I think, there's been a tendency in the party that I'm in, historically, and I mean, it started to change. Guys like Andy Barr, congressman from Kentucky, who's just so good on this issue, is let's don't spend any money on this. They chose to become homeless. I mean, that was sort of a theme I heard from a lot of conservative electeds. And the reality is, if you look at across the spectrum of homelessness and you look at a combat veteran who comes back with post-traumatic stress, they didn't choose that. They did that on our behalf. They were going over to fight that war, that battle on our behalf as a country. And I think we owe them to be able to get the best medical care we can, which includes mental health and behavioral health. And then when you start talking families and children and domestic violence with the moms and the kids, they didn't say, I want to become homeless. I want to get beaten up by my husband or boyfriend. And so I think that's where we got to step in.
Well, more than half the homeless population in America is children, 1.3 million adults, 1.5 million children. Was it the choice of any of them? You can't say it was the choice. Over half the homeless population in this country, clearly the Republican mantra of they chose this, you're right, veterans, women, victims
children,
of domestic abuse, children,
And so the good news is many people in the Republican Party are going, that was an old line, and we need to do that. And I think I've been called by so many Democrat mayors who say, and they always start with, this has to be an off-the-record conversation. You can't tell anybody you're talking to me. And he says, but wherever you go, it seems to be working well. So how are you getting that reduction? And part of it is, how do you lean into treatment? We know treatment works, and you don't get treatment in a jail, but you also get treatment in a park bench. And this idea, like we saw Blessing yesterday, and anybody who sits there and says, let Blessing be there and he's going to make good decision-making and such, that gentleman had no decision-making ability in my mind as a clinician. He needs to be in treatment, not hanging out literally at the corner of that street.
And I want to talk more about the people that we met yesterday. All three of us were out on the streets of Seattle yesterday doing outreach, witnessing the drug crisis that's affecting people suffering, and also interacting with the people that are doing a really good job of helping those people turn their lives around, get back on the right path. Any big takeaways? You're talking about your interaction with Blessing. Any other big takeaways from those interactions yesterday?
Well, we've talked about a few of them. I mean,
Yeah.
funding on the Republican side and sort of this, wokeness gone wild with having there be no accountability, telling people we're going to give you needles, give them pipes, provide drugs for them, and force no path to sobriety and no path to recovery. On some level, I think there's got to be strings attached. But, one of the things that was reinforced that I knew through Marbut and I knew before is that a homeless crisis, but it's a mental health crisis. And what a lot of people, the bigger problem is the mental health issue component of this. And what a lot of people I don't think understand is, where do you draw the line in the sand where addiction ends and personal responsibility takes over? And that's a discussion which we don't have enough expertise in. I certainly don't. Maybe you do. But where do you draw the line where addiction ends and you chose to put that needle in your arm, right? Or you chose to smoke that pipe. But Marbut has been quick to point out to me to say that 75-80% of the people that are abusing drugs and called addicts are untreated mental health cases. 75-80% of the addicts that are homeless on the street are not seeing a psychologist, not seeing a psychiatrist. They're not being prescribed pharmaceutical medication for anxiety, for depression, for bipolar, for schizophrenia. And they're also a component of the mental health crisis. Sure, it's part of the addict issue, but it's dual. Some people are alcoholics and addicts, but some people are self-medicating because they're mentally ill.
And for me, for the last 10 or 15 years, I think the harm reduction just sort of gone off the rails.
That's the term I was looking for.
Yeah, harm reduction.
The harm reduction. That's what I'm talking about. That's the wokeness kind of gone wild, is the harm reduction, where you don't hold anybody accountable.
Right.
We're in a place now in America, especially on the West Coast, and a little bit in New York, a little bit in Chicago, a little bit in Atlanta, but really the West Coast, is we're making it so easy to get high now and so hard to get treatment. In America, we should be leading with, how do we make it easy to get treatment and hard to get high? That's what we really should be doing. But that's not what's happened on the West Coast in particular.
I want to talk about compassion a little bit. We've thrown that word around here and yesterday a good amount and heard it thrown around. And I want to tie it to the Grants Pass Supreme Court case, actually. Robert was there for the oral arguments. There was a lot brought up in those arguments, but Justice Kagan made a striking statement during the arguments. She asked, where do we put them, referring to homeless people experiencing homelessness? If every city, every village, every town lacks compassion and passes a law identical to this, referring to the Grants Pass law, where are they supposed to sleep? Are they supposed to kill themselves not sleeping? And she's making a very clear moral statement here about compassion regarding policy addressing homelessness. To me, it seems like our understanding of compassion is kind of the ideological pinch point, pivot point in this whole issue. And in particular, balancing compassion with other values that sometimes, or principles like autonomy, that we allow to supersede our understanding of compassion. I think there's a really clear tension, and you were talking about this, Billy, between our idea of someone's individual autonomy, their ability to make their own choices in accordance with their own idea of their best life and their best interests, with my idea or your idea of a compassionate path for their life and direction. Any thoughts on that tension, on walking that line between accountability, compassion, defining compassion correctly so that we don't fall off the rails like we've done with harm reduction?
I don't think it's compassionate to let a person die on a street corner. I just don't think there's any compassion of what we saw yesterday with Blessing. And I felt bad for the 4 firefighters who arrived, the 2 sheriffs arrived, the nonprofits were there. There were plenty of people there reaching out to help Blessing. Yeah. But per the law of this state, he refused service, and there's nothing you can do beyond that. And so I just don't think that's compassionate. I think we need to start rethinking. Billy's been very open about this and saying we need to start rethinking this. And if it's to me, the most compassionate thing we can do is not throw you in jail, but also not let you rot on a street corner. It's getting you into a program and getting treatment and get out of homelessness forever. That, to me, is the most compassionate thing. It's sort of like what happened after COVID, that, the JAMA study, the medical journal, the sort of middle of the road, slightly left-of-center journal, and they studied San Francisco, that's sort of the worst city in the worst state. They found nobody had died on the streets because of COVID. They were dying in isolation in a room without treatment. And so you were taking a drug addict with deep mental health issues and putting them in a private room with no pre-treatment, no ongoing monitoring, and the death rate doubled. And 100% of the deaths increase was for two categories. It was drug overdose and a little bit trauma, so getting hit by a car. That was the second big bucket. And zero was because of COVID. And so it just shows you treatment works. And candidly, where we're at in the world of homelessness now, it's the medical equivalent of sending somebody to an ER who's having a heart attack, and you don't see the cardiologist. You don't get any tests made. We don't test your blood. We don't put you on an EKG or an EEG. We don't do any of that. We just keep you in the waiting room and we hope you recover. That's what we're doing now. We're sending you to the ER, but you don't get any treatment at all. It's not going to work.
Yeah, I had to do a conservatorship over a friend of mine, and we had to file papers in the court system. Like a ticking bomb, we had to wait for him to become a threat to himself or a threat to others, or harm to himself or harm to others. That was the way it was defined back then. And I had spent, $25,000 in legal fees to try and set up this conservatorship. And then we just waited, and it didn't happen for like a year and a half. And then finally, there was a physical altercation this person had. We were able to get him the treatment that he was too mentally ill to know that he needed. And then once he got it, he's now been working and living independently for the last 25 years. This happened 27 years ago. And he's been living independently and working and supporting himself and living a life with no services and no support, no monitoring. Nobody's checking on him. He's just back on his feet. And, it shouldn't have to be in the courts with judges $25,000 and waiting a year and a half. I think a healthcare professional and a first responder and a social worker could make an evaluation right there in the moment. The person that I could have made the evaluation. I have no.
It was so obvious to everybody there.
Or if you need 3 out of 4 departments to sign off on it and agree, you would have had them all there yesterday. You would have had, the nonprofits. You would have social workers. You would have first responders, police, fire. They would have, and we could have gotten that guy off the street, and it wouldn't have been pleasant. It wouldn't have been pleasant, but
he would have gotten his treatment. And I will bet we're going to hear that individual passes on. Probably in the next 2 or 3 months.
22 years old.
Unless something changes. Because I thought he was going to pass. When we first saw him, I thought he was on his way.
We don't always know what's best for ourselves in the moment. And if we're willing to accept that premise, then we can get people
if you have
what they need.
If you're bipolar or schizophrenic and you're high on heroin, of course, you're impaired. You can't drive a car because you're impaired. You can't make that decision for yourself.
If we saw a guy on a street who had a gun to his head, literally, and we had a gun to his head, we'd be all over that. I mean, people would be jumping on him, they'd be taking him away, they'd be getting the help he needed. And to me, fentanyl is actually more dangerous now. Fentanyl, there's nothing, we've never seen a drug that devastating ever invented by man on planet Earth here. Fentanyl has just changed the game. And the idea that a lot of the harm reduction people say you could choose and when you're ready you want to get help.
Right.
Fentanyl has changed that. And most people on fentanyl don't know they need help.
I think a lot of the divisiveness around this issue that we're all familiar with, and certainly among my peers and people my age, has to do with kind of knee-jerk reactions to anything that looks like an assault on someone's autonomy, ability to make their own choices, or is paternalistic. And obviously, when you're there, it seems so clear that these people need someone to love them enough, to care about their life enough, that they're willing to step in, even when they can't see that for themselves.
And Billy's example of your friend was amazing. It was very intense right when the incident happened, and it was intense to get the person in. But it was amazing how fast
they stabilized on the antipsychotic and schizophrenia meds. But
once he
two
was
or 3 weeks
stabilized,
later, he turned a corner and he never looked back. 25 years later.
But once he was stabilized, that person had gone on. You had waited 18 months. That person had it, and within 3 or 4 weeks, you got him to stable. And 22 years later, he's doing great.
Yeah.
That's what we should be doing for everybody.
That's what we should be believing in for everybody, that everybody can have a future like that. Last question to hop back to the documentary tonight. When and where can people watch the Americans with No Address documentary?
Well, we're doing private screenings now in front of like Salvation Armies and rescue missions and people who have been involved in putting the movie together. And then we're going to do the festival circuit because we have a chance to be considered by the Academy, which is fabulous. Cool. And so that means we'll do the Academy or the festival circuit. Then after that, it will go to streaming, and hopefully by the end of summer. And then the theatrical movie, which Billy's the star of, will be going out in the fall. And you'll see that in theaters, the old theater near you.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you both for joining me today. I'm encouraged to see people come together on this issue, find common ground. So important, I think, for all of America to see that, and especially people my age. So encouraged by you both and your work on this issue, and thank you for being here. A cleaning crew was met by 50 pounds of animal feces in an apartment home after the residents were evicted. The Tacoma property south of Seattle spent $8,000 restoring the home to conditions suitable for new residents. This costly cleanup came after the resident failed to pay rent for almost 2.5 years, accumulating an unpaid balance of more than $37,000. This is from my latest article in a series of weekly articles that provide different perspectives on the landlord-tenant relationship and housing policy by giving a voice to stories that you might not hear otherwise. This story is a story of neglect. Oftentimes, when it comes to evictions, we hear crazy stories about criminal activity and behavior, and that are mind-boggling and make us ask how someone could ever have stayed in that unit for so long. This story is different. Once the residents were evicted, neighbors on the property noticed a couple of pets outside on the balcony, and management and animal services were called. Sadly, one of the animals died, and the other two had been left outside after the resident was evicted, causing the 50 pounds of animal feces that I mentioned earlier, along with tons of damage caused by the resident inside. Cleaning crews spent hours and hours unloading all of the furniture, replacing all of the hardware, the appliances, blinds, carpets, full painting job. And this, I think, should make us ask ourselves how, if we were in this situation, if you were the homeowner of this unit, how long you could bear the burden of someone else's neglect. Again, this is a story of neglect, not criminal activity, but it's neglect that ended up costing at least $37,000 to the homeowner. And there's just no other situation in our justice system in which someone else's neglect costs you that money, and that's just how the situation plays out in court. All of the justice, there is no justice because all of the court weighs in favor of the person causing that kind of damage. I certainly could not last for 2.5 years enduring that kind of burden caused by someone else, and I feel for homeowners that have to do this. Stay tuned for my next article in this series, again, where I cover landlord-tenant relationship issues and housing policy that you might not otherwise hear. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Restorations Podcast, where we were joined by Billy Baldwin and Robert Marbut to hear their perspectives on untreated mental illness and addiction, and be encouraged by people like them on opposite ends of the political spectrum coming together and sharing and finding common ground on this issue, and emphasizing the importance of compassion paired with accountability. I think that there is a growing consensus on the horizon, and meeting people at Union Gospel Mission and Salvation Army with Billy and Robert makes me so confident that we know what works and how to truly help people, and that lives are being changed for the better there every day. Watch out this summer for the release of the Americans with No Address documentary and for a decision from the Supreme Court on the Grants Pass v. Johnson case. You can learn more about Discovery's Fix Homelessness initiative at fixhomelessness.org, and on whatever platform you're listening to this episode on, please follow, like, subscribe so that you don't miss the next episode of the Restorations podcast.